It's taking a long time to actually build more housing, but in Normal, there are plenty of projects in the pipeline.
In the time I've been here, we have not seen this many multifamily projects come through in a calendar year.
You'll hear from Normal Town Planner Mercy Davison. That's coming up on WGLT's news magazine, Sound Ideas. Good evening, I'm Lauren Warnicki. On today's show, you'll also meet a memoirist who retraced his father's journey across Eastern Europe during the Holocaust.
It was to bridge a gap between my father and myself, and to witness at some remove the events of his life.
You'll hear from poet Jason Sommer ahead of his visit to Bloomington-Normal, plus a new installment of our feel-good More of That Please series. That's coming up after a Bloomington-Normal news update. This is Sound Ideas on 89.1 WGLT and WGLT.org, part of the NPR network.
Support for WGLT comes from Bloomington-Normal Audiology. Hear My Story continues with local patient Paul Brandt.
So I just went without them for all those years. I talked to somebody who had recently gotten hearing aids and talked about the fact that they were connected to the TV. And so that kind of prompted me to try it again.
Paul's full story can be found at bnaudiology.com.
From the campus of Illinois State University in Normal, this is WGLT's news magazine, Sound Ideas. I'm Lauren Warnicki, sitting in for John Norton. There's been a lot of talk about the need for new housing in Bloomington-Normal, a 7,500 unit shortfall at last check. There's also been a lot of attention paid to barriers, such as high interest rates, bank skittishness on loans, and construction costs. And yet, the town of Normal gave at least early approval last year for the development of more than 1,400 new units. In this interview with WGLT's Charlie Schlenker, town planner Mercy Davison says there is stuff in the pipeline, but there's a long lead time for such projects.
Well, we certainly had a lot of proposals that came to the council and were approved. Lots of multifamily units were approved in 2023, and we saw a lot more interest in that sector for obvious reasons. We approved final plats for about 185 units. That does not include, though, the preliminary approvals on a couple of large multifamily developments. So they were also approved in 2023, but they don't have that final approval that they need. So if you add those in, that's another 477 units for Carden Springs planned unit development and 136 units at the Archer planned unit development. The council also approved a very large subdivision of multiple types of residential called Infinity Point on the west side of town. They approved that as a preliminary plan. And ultimately, when built out, that would have up to approximately 400 units. But as of yet, they haven't gone to the final platting process. So it's two different numbers, what's been final platted and what's been preliminarily approved.
Compare that to historical averages, would you?
I would say for multifamily, this is considerably more multifamily residential approval outside of student-oriented types of multifamily. So in the time I've been here, we have not seen this many multifamily projects come through in a calendar year.
And what are you thinking about for this year?
It really comes down to land availability and what properties are undeveloped and for sale. And I don't know the answer to that. So in this past year and a half, we've just seen a few fairly sizable chunks of ground that became available, and that's when the development proposals came through. I really don't know what that's going to look like in 2024.
Does it look like the marketplace is responding to the articulated need for housing in the community?
I would say yes. Again, this is the first time we've seen this kind of proposal for non-student-oriented multifamily development, and that must be because the developers proposing it see the opportunity there and see the need. That's why they're doing it.
There's been a lot of talk about how the marketplace factors of higher interest rates, banker reluctance, and in some cases, not necessarily locally, bank wobbliness, are limiting the pace of the activity. Do you see that?
Anecdotally, from what I hear from developers, interest rates definitely are a factor, and what it costs to get a construction loan in the last year or two. There's also Certain materials are still more expensive than they used to be. I'm not sure the extent to which labor is an issue anymore. I don't know. But for a while, that was also slowing things down. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of on the cost side that has made these developments probably slow down a little bit.
Do you think the pace will pick up this year? I mean, what is left available?
Well, I mean, you can look at a map of Normal and you can see where there's undeveloped ground, and you can look at the zoning and see where that land is zoned for residential development or perhaps hasn't been annexed yet. So you could look at that map, and then you just have to ask yourself, well, is that land for sale? And sometimes you also have to ask, are there utilities available? Is there water and sewer adjacent? Not every property that isn't developed is actually easily developed. But we talk about that in our comprehensive plan, and we have areas in town that we consider to be very appropriate for development. It just turns out sometimes that the landowner isn't interested in parting with their property.
How many such areas are there? Put a sense of scale on that, would you?
There's a combination of maps in the comprehensive plan that talk about our growth priorities, and those the areas shown on that map show you which areas are most available for development based on being undeveloped and being adjacent to roadways that have been improved and utilities that are pretty much in place. Then you'd have to look at the land use map to see of those areas which are kind of set up for a future of residential development. And you'd find probably a few hundred acres, across the entire community if you were really looking. And then there's also the ability to ask for rezoning too.
Are there readily identifiable chunks that are prime at this point? Say by Heartland Community College?
Yeah, driving around, you can see which fields are still being farmed and not developed. The one you're referencing across from Heartland, our comprehensive plan does call for that in the long term to be primarily residential development. As of this moment, I don't know what the interest level is of those owners for selling it. I know, I'm not an expert on farmland ownership and finance, but I know it's complicated with how you dispose of farmland property and how that impacts your, taxes, et cetera. So that again, that goes beyond what I really know, but I understand that does affect the timing of sales and that sort of thing.
This is Sound Ideas. I'm Charlie Schlenker. We're talking with Mercy Davison, the town planner in the town of Normal. That particular example is not quite on the edge of town, but it certainly isn't in the inner core of the town of Normal. Are there closer in things that the town has readily identified as infill opportunities or desirable for infill?
We typically wait for people to come to us with a proposal because we don't want to interfere with private property owners' plans to sell or not sell their properties. That said, we have, of course, looked at Uptown South as an infill opportunity because we own it, which is unusual. We don't have a lot of opportunities like that, but that is one for sure. When the Fairview Senior Housing Project proposal came along a few years back, as you may recall, to turn the old sanatorium into affordable senior housing, we were very interested in that. That's a perfect infill opportunity on a beautiful site. So we're opportunistic. When these opportunities come along, if they're good ones, we support them strongly. But we don't have just like a list of, here are infill sites that we really want to see something happen with.
Well, those two examples, Uptown South and the Fairview Tuberculosis Sanatorium, and also the old health department site, it's the same thing, have been identified as potential affordable housing, or in the case of Fairview, senior housing. Is that likely to move forward given the current interest rate climate this year?
As I understand it, the Fairview project is not moving forward. The group that had come through the public process to get the project approved locally was unsuccessful in getting the tax credits they needed from the state. And they tried really hard. They submitted more than once. We thought it was a great project. It didn't rise to the level of recognition by the state. The state has very few of these tax credits available, as I understand it, and they went elsewhere in the state. That project is not going to move forward. Uptown South, we have a conceptual plan that's really solid. We have not started to actively talk to anyone about ideas for that site. There's more to do in advance. We still need to do other types of planning for design guidelines and study the infrastructure, et cetera. But it is an opportunity, and that's going to, almost certainly go back to the issue of somebody out there getting tax credits from the state to do affordable housing, if that's the route that is taken.
Has it been discussed at the staff level whether the town should be offering local incentives rather than statewide tax credits to facilitate affordable housing, since that's been an identified need in the community as well?
I'm not aware of any discussion of that at the town level or just locally in general. The kinds of incentives that the state has available are pretty significant. That would require a lot of discussion locally if we were to try to make up for that with a local incentive.
What else needs to be said about the prospects for further housing construction and development in 2024?
We hear that the interest rates may stabilize or start to go down. That will certainly help. We have a very robust group of agencies and institutions that have been working together now for a couple of years on housing strategies, some of which is focused on affordable and some of which is just generally housing. The Regional Planning Commission right now is amidst a study of housing, and so they'll be hopefully releasing some results late winter, early spring, with some recommendations that should be really helpful for the community.
That's Normal Town Planner Mercy Davison. She spoke with WGLT's Charlie Schlenker. Stories and conversations from Bloomington-Normal and Central Illinois. This is WGLT's Sound Ideas. I'm Lauren Warnicki. A memoirist who retraced his father's journey across Eastern Europe during the Holocaust is coming to Bloomington-Normal. St. Louis-based poet Jason Sommer will speak at the Normal Public Library and Moses Montefiore Temple on January 27th. He tells WGLT's Lindsay Jones that his memoir, Schmoyles Bridge, is less about recounting the history of the Holocaust and more about the relationship between fathers and sons and the nature of truth.
I didn't expect to be writing a book and wouldn't have written the book had it not been for an editor friend who, had a need for nonfiction books. And I proposed something to him, and he said, I'd be interested. I know your poems, and I know the stories in your poems. Do you have anything that would tie them together in any way? And I said, well, no. Oh, yeah. We went on this trip, my father and I, to visit the places that he'd been interned and the place of his birth. And we tried to find the bridge from which his brother tried to escape from an Auschwitz-bound train transport. And there was silence on the other end of the phone line, and he said, write me a chapter.
The book that you authored and that you're discussing here in Bloomington-Normal later this month is about a physical trip to those places in Europe where your father had been, where your extended family had been during the wartime, during the Holocaust. But I noticed you kind of balk at that being the only characterization of that book. Can you say more about what that book is and what it means?
Part of the importance, if the book has importance, it's also covering the Hungarian Holocaust. We forget Hungary was an ally of Germany, and they passed anti-Jewish legislation at the same time in the 20s that the Germans did, and they were enthusiastic in their assistance with the deportation of Jews, even before the Germans moved in to actually take control of Hungary. I think that's little known, really, because Auschwitz takes up all the space in a way. It has become a kind of shorthand for it, but there was lots that happened outside of Auschwitz. So there's that some element, but really the book isn't about the Holocaust chiefly. It's about fathers and sons, a father and a son against the background of difficult history, that which of course casts a shadow on and between the relationship.
One thing I was particularly taken by is your writing of what it means to be the child of a parent who has experienced great trauma. So that story, that trauma is kind of always looming over you. Whether you know the details or whether you do not, that doesn't change the fact that when you are young, you feel diminished next to it. And it's also not lost on me that you took that trip in your 50s.
Right.
Is that when you felt ready for it?
Yes, there was some element of being ready for it, a man in my own right. Mm-hmm. I had published some books. I had won some awards. I felt able for it. The trip that led to Schmoyles Bridge was designed for something more personal. I didn't think of it as instrumental in any other project, but it was to bridge a gap between my father and myself, and to witness at some remove the events of his life, and to come closer to him.
To what extent do you feel that worked?
I do feel that it worked. I mean, there were some very dramatic moments. There were moments where I saw the rawness of my father's injuries. His brother, the loss of his brother was the deepest loss. I mean, there were over 60 family members that were murdered, but his brother was the one for him. And so when we, at my insistence, tried to commemorate his brother, I felt both that I was helping him lay a ghost in a way and come to peace with something, but I also felt, at least afterwards, that I had probed the wound a little bit so that I could see what was genuine, what was less practiced. After a while, my father, he talked about the Holocaust. He did appearances, and spoke about it. He was National Teacher of the Year. I mean, his America's Success Stories is incredible, but it layered practice at speaking that seemed to distance him from the events. And I had maybe it's a writer's need, maybe it's a bad child's desire to get closer to authenticity in some way.
It's interesting because you want to get it right, but what is right? How do you convey what is actual truth? Because there are so many things about that, right? There's the way that it's presented. That's its own kind of thing. There's the actual facts. And then there's the way that you hear it as it's presented to you. There's so many things that converge into making a memory or truth. And I feel like you explore that, and that's why the memoir is not necessarily structured like some more typical memoirs are. Like there's all kinds of movement.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. There's some interrogation of the whole process, but there's a real effort on my part with maps and other memoirs and other testimony to make sure that I was as right as I could be. And with my father, sometimes he would witness an event. There's a hanging that he witnesses as he's moving back into Budapest after escaping from the Russian army. And I was able to find out who was being hung and correct his impression that it was vigilante justice, because it wasn't. There was a committee, and it was not very well done as executions go, but he was wrong about what was happening. I was able to tell him that, which gave me a little authority in all these stories, which I think I needed too. That I had something to contribute that was keeping not him honest, but it honest, the telling as accurate as could be.
Did you have family members alive at the time of publication that were able to respond to the book that you put out?
Yes, I have some cousins. There were people in my family who weren't delighted at the portraiture sometimes, and that's been a history. There's personal portraiture in my poems, and that people don't like, but the truth as I saw it, and I don't think I've performed character assassination on anybody, but there was also a sense, especially my Aunt Lily, who didn't speak until a certain point, and then did, that you were telling tales out of school. This was family business, and why were you talking about this? There's always the risk. I mean, if you're trying to tell the truth and as whole a version of the truth, sometimes people are going to see it differently.
That was WGLT's Lindsay Jones speaking with poet Jason Sommer. Sommer will be a guest of the Normal Public Library and Moses Montefiore Temple on Saturday, January 27th. You're listening to Sound Ideas on 89.1 WGLT. I'm Lauren Warnicki. Finally today, every so often on WGLT, we bring you the story of an unsung community servant who's making Bloomington-Normal a better place. Today, we introduce you to a Bloomington man who has dedicated 3 decades of his life fighting against malaria in foreign countries. In this edition of More of That, Please, Normal Rotary Club member Drake Zimmerman just marked the distribution of 3 billion mosquito nets worldwide through an organization he helped create. Here's student reporter Megan Spurline with the story.
Malaria is a bloodborne parasite that causes anemia due to loss of red blood cells. It can often lead to kidney failure, chills, fever, coma, and sometimes death. Inspired by the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, Drake Zimmerman started the Malaria Project in 1993 after hearing about a new medicine that cures malaria.
We as Rotarians have the role of being leaders and identifying where are the gaps, what needs to happen, what does the scientific community need in order to move forward with this particular innovation, what does the donor community need in terms of data to move forward and to help fund a particular intervention that is very effective, what does the local community need.
Zimmerman now co-chairs Rotarians Against Malaria Global. Implementing and distributing mosquito nets to countries in Africa and Asia was a 4-stage process. First the pilot project, then proof of scale, then distributing the nets countrywide, then across multiple countries. Through a Rotary matching grant, the pilot study was conducted in Ghana in 2002, where nearly 15,000 insecticide beta nets were distributed through an existing measles vaccination campaign. Zimmerman says to further prove the mosquito net's effectiveness, another 25,000 nets were distributed in Zambia in 2003.
We got the same results, higher coverage rates than had ever before been achieved, with greater impact at a much lower cost.
The following year, the Rotarians entered the 3rd stage of the process, distributing over 1 million nets to the people of Togo. Multi-country distributions began in 2005, with over 14,000 nets being distributed in just a few years. Zimmerman saw firsthand how the nets were keeping mosquitoes out and helping reduce malaria's spread.
When people don't have malaria, they can show up for work, they can plant their crops, they can tend their crops, harvest their crops, sell their crops, take care of their families. The impact on the community of not having malaria is absolutely gigantic.
RAM Global is now helping to distribute more than 280 million mosquito nets each year to more than 20 countries.
So right now we've had district after district after district get themselves cleared of malaria and then certified, and they have this local pride in maintaining that certification of no cases being transmitted. So we as RAM Global, looking globally, are taking those methods and taking them to India, we're taking them to Africa, where there are much higher rates of malaria.
In addition to providing nets, RAM Global helps train community healthcare workers to learn to treat malaria and encourages a sense of belonging through community cleanup and soccer tournaments for youth. Zimmerman says his connection with Rotary made this all possible.
RAM Global's efforts helped significantly reduce malaria cases worldwide, but cases have increased in recent years. The World Health Organization cites conflict and humanitarian crises, resource constraints, and biological challenges, including drug and insecticide resistance, as slowing the effort to eradicate malaria. The WHO also notes extreme weather events fueled by climate change as aiding the survival of mosquitoes that transmit malaria. Normal Rotary Club member Drake Zimmerman spoke to WGLT student reporter Megan Spurline. If you have a suggestion for a More of That Please feature, email us. We're at news@wglt.org. Thanks for choosing WGLT's Sound Ideas, made possible in part by Bloomington-Normal Audiology. I'm Lauren Warnicki. Story help today came from WGLT's Charlie Schlenker, Lindsay Jones, and student reporter Megan Spurline. Ryan Toohey edits the show. This is 89.1 WGLT and WGLT.org, part of the NPR network.